So in this video, I'm going to carry on from where I left off, looking at Lori Vallow Daybell's delusional behaviour. What I want to talk about in this video is the kind of delusion that many people have, the kind of delusion that too many people have, that can really get in your way, you know, when you're just trying to live a contented life. And that's the kind of delusion that wouldn't meet the criteria for delusional disorder. Even though these people are just as delusional, even though you can show them all the evidence to the contrary and it makes no difference, I thought that watching how the judge responded to Lori Vallow Daybell will be useful to us when we think about how we respond to people who are delusional about not having any responsibility for their own behaviours. From watching footage of her flirting with the police, I get the impression that Lori Vallow is someone who can make other people feel very special when she wants to. She seems to have the capacity to love bomb. When the person seems to have two characters, when they can appear to be really excited about you and really attentive towards you and perhaps even loving towards you, then it can be confusing when they can also be really nasty and cruel at other times. And the people who find themselves stuck in abusive relationships think that when the person's being nasty, they're not really being themselves. Not accepting who the person really is means that when they do something horrible, you need them to say sorry because you've decided they're somebody else who doesn't normally do things like that. So if they don't say sorry, you're just really confused. That feeling is cognitive dissonance, when you're trying to hold two opposite realities in your head at the same time. And it's that keeps you trapped, because as long as you feel that way, you need something from the other person. You need them either to say sorry and to be the person you thought they were, the nice person, or you need them to say they're not sorry, they like to be nasty to you, they're never going to be sorry, and then at least you know that's who they are. But you have to make that decision for yourself. You can't rely on the other person to do that for you, because that's all part of the game that abusive people play. They want to keep you confused. As long as you're confused, your focus is on yourself and not on them, and so they can get away with more. So if you recognise any of this in you, as I'm talking, see if you can imagine yourself seeing that person in the way that the judge sees Lori Vallow Daybell. In other words, accepting the darker side of them as being who they really are.
All right, the court will conclude then with my own review of the matter and then pronounce sentence. Very notably, you're 50 years old. These are the first criminal convictions you've ever had.
Notice how his voice is monotone, how he talks about things that go in Lori Vallow Daybell's favour, and he talks about the things against her in the same tone of voice.
You elected not to cooperate with the pre-sentence investigation. I'm advising you that that was your choice to not cooperate in the pre-sentence investigation, but it left me without some additional information that potentially could have been mitigating in your case. And as I proceed with the sentencing, I'll note those deficiencies in the information I normally would have in a pre-sentence investigation report.
If he's feeling emotion, he's not showing it. And I've taken this lack of apparent emotion as being about him seeing her behaviour for what it is and then accepting what that means about her. And it's that acceptance that I think allows him not to be particularly emotional about this. As a result of it, he doesn't seem to be finding it frustrating that she's not taking any responsibility. There doesn't seem to be a struggle inside of him.
I also have to consider whether the criminal conduct was the result of circumstances unlikely to recur. Based on the evidence in this case, and in particular, considering the statement you just made to the court, I find it weighs against me finding in mitigation for that factor.
And we know he wants her to feel responsible for what she's done.
During the trial, when the evidence came out about how these children were found and the state they were in, you wanted to be excused and not have to watch the evidence and we're fine to let all the other people in the courtroom, including the jurors, have to bear through that. However, I ruled that you did have to sit and watch and see the result of your heinous crimes.
Even though he wanted that, and even though he's just heard this long speech where she makes it absolutely clear that she thinks she's fine, she's a very good mother, she hasn't done anything wrong, and so on, he is still calm, because as soon as she says these things, I would guess he immediately accepts what that means about her.
I don't have an LSI score, which is one value I can look at to help determine whether or not you'd be likely to reoffend. I don't have that because you wouldn't cooperate with the report.
So all he's doing now is focusing on what the consequences now need to be. Now that he's seen, right, this is your behavior, that's what it means about you, and so here are the consequences.
I have to consider four main objectives. Number one, the protection of society, which is the primary objective. Two, deterrence of the individual and public generally. Three, possibility of rehabilitation. And four, punishment or retribution for wrongdoing. You've served a very long time of local jail, over 1,200 days, and the report is you've been a great inmate, never caused a problem for anyone in the jail. And you should be commended for that. And that also shows that you are capable of that.
Can you imagine sitting through the trial, seeing this woman smirking after you've viewed the horrendous photos of her dead children? It would be so hard to be able to talk about anything she did well and to praise her for it, wouldn't it? If it was me, I'd do it through gritted teeth.
I believe your counsel when they tell me you're an intelligent person. Up until all these events began to transpire, you've achieved goals in your life, you've done important things in your life. And I'd note that despite some of the comments here today, I have found that during my interactions with you throughout this long case, including your trial, you've been respectful of the court.
Now, obviously, as a judge, he's not directly victimised as a result of her behaviour. And in a lot of situations, when you do find yourself getting emotional, it will be because you're directly involved. But that's why I'm using this example. This is how a judge needs to be. They need to be able to be unemotional so that they can be objective. But when you can think more objectively, that also does you a massive favour. If he was sitting there, bubbling up with rage, if that was obvious, maybe her attorney could have tried to insist on a retrial.
I think it must be considered in mitigation that you do have mental health issues. I've dealt with those throughout the context of this case where there were commitment proceedings. I've reviewed those reports and have that personal information from having gone through the determinations of whether or not you were competent or fit to stand trial. Sometimes I feel like maybe too many cases settle, and there should be more trials because it's a right people are entitled to exercise. You exercise that right, and I in no way hold it against you that you decided to have your case determined by a jury. That's your right, and it does not impact or influence my decision in sentencing.
Can you imagine how things would be if when someone showed you their true colours, you were able to see what that behaviour meant about that person and accept it? It doesn't mean you'd have to feel good about who the person is. It doesn't mean you'd have to forgive and forget or anything like that. The opposite, really. It means that you would be able to see who they were and then make a decision accordingly, on how you're going to behave in reaction to that. If you need to protect yourself, how are you going to do that? If you're stuck in the frame of mind of not accepting what that behaviour means about that person, then you're going to try to keep changing them. You're going to try to get them to feel differently from how they feel, to think differently from how they think, and to behave differently from how they behave. And all of that means you're not accepting reality. And so while you're in that frame of mind of trying to get them to change in some way, you can't protect yourself. You can't be ready for the truth of who they are and for how they're next going to behave towards you. You're too busy being in denial.
You were afforded all of your due process in this case, and ultimately, after presentation of the evidence, a jury did find you guilty on all counts. When there is a trial, I learn and see all of the facts along with the jurors. Murder is the most serious offense. And the most unimaginable type of murder is to have a mother murdering her own children, and that's exactly what you did. You were involved in and guilty of conspiring to murder another group of children's mother, Tammy Daybell, who had children of her own. And despite the jury convicting you with overwhelming evidence, you still sit here before the court today and said you didn't do it.
Accepting that Lori Vallow feels no responsibility. She thinks she's great. Yes, he's got this report from the psychiatrist or the psychologist that he can look at about her, and I'm sure that would have helped. You know, he can look at it and see, yeah, she's delusional, and she's got a personality disorder. And we don't always have that. You know, we meet people who haven't been diagnosed with anything, or they don't tell us that they have. And so we then have to decide, what does that behaviour mean about them? But it's very easy to do as long as you're willing to do it. You know, it's not being willing to do it that is the problem. That is what makes things really difficult for you. And it doesn't do them any favours for you to be misunderstanding what this means about them. And of course, it doesn't do you any favours. If you accept who somebody really is because of how they're behaving, then it doesn't mean that you're not going to believe it if they change. If their behaviour changes, maybe that will say something about who they are, who they're now becoming. Sometimes people do learn from their mistakes. Sometimes they do mature, but the proof is in the pudding. You know, you can't decide you want them to mature and therefore they must. It just doesn't work like that.
You came here to East Idaho, where I've spent my life, and moved here from another place already with plans in progress to make your children disappear. The evidence bore that out at trial. You removed your children from their home in Arizona, alienated them from friends and family, got rid of JJ's service dog. You moved to Rexburg, a community where you could find 1,000 random families to take your children, and you brought them here to murder them.
At this point, there is emotion in the way he talks. His emotion doesn't come from repeatedly trying to get Lori Vallow to take responsibility for her actions. He hasn't tried to do that, and he's not trying to do that now. He's not wishing she would apologise or wishing she would stop pretending and stop deluding herself. If he was, we'd see that struggle in him. We'd see that he was frustrated. Instead, what we see is sadness and anger. That comes from accepting what the person did and what that means about her. That's what's painful to him. So you have to find the courage to face that pain in order to be able to live in the real world, in order to not be in denial about what people's motivations are, and in order to be able to have real boundaries.
You had so many other options. You could have gotten divorced. You could have found someone to take care of those kids. But as the state was able to prove at trial, you chose the most evil and destructive path possible. You killed those children, according to the state's theory, and I believe it, to remove them as obstacles and to profit financially. You justified all of this by going down a bizarre religious rabbit hole, and clearly you are still down there.
So he's saying you're not taking responsibility because you're deluding yourself. So again, that's acceptance. He's not fighting that, he accepts it.
I knew they were dead. They were found dead, burned, mutilated, and dismembered, and buried like animals. Tammy Daybell was murdered as a result of your conspiracy. She was, by all accounts, a healthy, happy mother and wife through a lot of her life. And you were out shopping for wedding rings to marry her husband while she was still alive. You were planning a wedding to her husband while she was still alive. You haven't shown any remorse for any of those actions.
He states that as a fact he has accepted.
JJ and Tylee, of course, 7 years old, 16 years old, were separate people whose lives were cut way too short because of you. Never got to grow up and be adults. The family and friends who have provided their impact statements, of course, have stated it better than I could about who they were. And it is a loss for everyone that you took them away from this world. And it is the most shocking thing, really, I can imagine, is that a mother killed her own children and you simply have no remorse for it. Even sitting here today, there's no remorse for what you did.
Imagine if he wasn't able to punish her until she'd agreed she did something evil. He'd be getting so frustrated and we'd see that. He'd end up raising his voice probably. Maybe he'd even end up begging her to admit to what she'd done. But he doesn't need that validation from her. He's in a position we don't usually get to be in for different reasons. First, he has the power to punish her. So that already makes things easier. We don't usually have that power to punish people. If we did, I'm sure we'd all feel a lot less angry at those times when people do the wrong thing by us. The second thing that puts him in a different position to us is that she was forced to sit there and listen to him judge her crimes. Usually someone wouldn't give you the time of day if you tried to list what they'd done wrong. But although I think he did a really professional job, this isn't about whether he's good at this in his personal life as well. It's just about seeing what acceptance looks like in someone. You can still have a goal to accept what someone's done in the way he does, without having the power to punish anyone, and without them sitting there listening to everything you've got to say.
While you were enjoying your new life in Hawaii, countless law enforcement officers, family members, and volunteers were searching for your children. And I don't think to this day you have any remorse for the effort and heartache you caused for others who looked for your children when you knew where they were. After all of this evidence through trial, you haven't shown any remorse. You haven't said you're sorry. You haven't done anything to seek leniency from this court. There's been a lot of people during trial and here who have explained the devastation you're responsible for, and you've forever altered the lives, not in a good way, for many, many people, destroying family relationships, taking people away that were loved, cared for, and needed. You may not believe to this day that you've done anything wrong, and you still may think you're justified by your religious beliefs for what happened here. I'm not here to judge that, but I don't believe that any God in any religion would want to have this happen, what happened here. And your crimes are heinous and egregious, and that alone can constitute a major aggravating factor that requires me to impose a serious length of incarceration.
What is the secret behind being able to see what someone's behaviour really means about them? How do people do it? What are you not doing if you're not doing it? Well, the answer is it's all about a need we might have. If you have a need for somebody to be the way you want them to be, then you won't accept the truth about them. You'll keep trying to get them to be different, and so as a result, you won't be ready for how they behave. You won't be able to protect yourself. Your boundaries will get crossed continually. If you don't have a need, if you can sit back and think, here's what they've done, clearly they're not someone I can trust, for example, then it's like, there's nothing holding you back. There's nothing in your way. You're ready to look out for yourself, and that has to be the goal. Because if you have a need to hold on to people who don't treat you well, then how are you going to be happy? How are you going to be healthy? You know, you have to face up to that need, ask yourself what it's about, and work on it. Work on getting to the point where you don't feel that need anymore. You can decide to accept who that person is, to accept that they don't care about how much you want them to take responsibility, that they are behaving in this way because it's in their interest to do that. It serves them to delude themselves. And so if you try to pull them away from their delusion, they're not going to suddenly decide it doesn't serve them to delude themselves. You know, that they're going to keep believing what they believe, and you're just going to get more and more worked up and angry because you're not accepting reality. You know, you're not accepting that they are who they are and this is how they deal with things. Yeah, it's really screwed up. For sure. She has been diagnosed with a personality disorder. She has disordered thinking. That's what that means. And enough disordered thinking for her whole personality to be disrupted by it. And that doesn't mean that personality disorders cannot be cured. I'm a strong believer that they can be, as long as the person wants them to be. So in the case of narcissistic personality disorder, that's incredibly unlikely because the person doesn't want to be cured. They don't think there's anything wrong with them. That's part of the whole nature of their personality disorder. I guess the main takeaway from all of this is that if you can accept that the kind of person who does something that you think is so awful that you would never dream of doing is very likely also to be the kind of person who deludes themselves into thinking what they did was fine. The kind of person who will never take responsibility for it and will never be genuinely sorry for it, even if they say they're sorry. You know, and that is who they are. And the only way you're going to feel okay about that and be able to move on from that and to be able to deal with it when it happens in the future with other people is for you to accept that reality and to understand that you won't get what you want, and that's not personal. It's not about you. You cannot get what you want from a person like that. The only thing you can do is decide, right, if that's how that person is, what am I going to do to protect myself? I can't get anything out of them. So what does that mean I have to do? What's the action I have to take? Is it that I don't see them anymore? Or is it that I only see them X amount of times a year? Or is it that when they do X, I do Y, you know, in order to protect myself? Whatever it is, that responsibility is completely and entirely yours because they're not willing to help, you know. So the only time when you're going to be ready to take on that responsibility is when you stop waiting for them to change. And when you stop waiting for them to take responsibility, for them to do anything differently. And being able to do that makes you self-sufficient. It means you're not codependent anymore. You know, there's a myth that goes on that when you're codependent, you will never not be. And it's simply not true. So I hope that was helpful. That's something, by the way, that I look at in the courses I run. So if you're interested in one of my courses, please get in touch. Please email me at contact@liveabusefree.com. If you haven't subscribed, please subscribe and I'll see you in the next video.